From above, Amsterdam's canals curve through the city in perfect arcs, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of Europe's most photographed urban landscapes. But this wasn't always water and stone. 7 centuries ago, there were no canals here, no bridges, no cobbled streets, just a marshy floodplain where the Amstel River met the Zuiderzee, a landscape of reeds and tidal mud that flooded twice daily. This video uses AI-generated imagery to reconstruct Amsterdam's visual history across 7 centuries. The reconstructions are interpretive, based on historical evidence, but filling gaps where no images survive, allowing us to see a city that's been rebuilt, burned, and transformed beyond recognition. We'll watch a fishing settlement emerge from the Marsh, see medieval timber houses crowd around a simple dam, walk the Golden Age streets when Amsterdam was the richest city on earth, stand in the Jewish quarter before it was emptied, and trace how a village built on wooden pilings became one of Europe's most complex urban experiments, a city that shouldn't exist on land that was never meant to be walked on. For nearly 3,000 years before any city rose here, this was empty marshland. Wet peat stretched along a shallow river channel, flooded by tides, abandoned when waters receded. Humans passed through, but rarely stayed. Beneath what is now the Damrak, archaeologists found fragments of bell beaker pottery, vessels shaped between 2200 and 2000 BC by hands that knew stone tools and seasonal crops. Under the Roken, a granite grinding stone from 2700 BC, worn smooth by grain that fed families we will never name. These are not the ruins of villages. They are traces of temporary camps, occupied when the marsh dried enough to farm, deserted when autumn rains returned. For centuries, the land refused permanent settlement. Too wet? Too unstable? The river, that we now call the Amstel, flowed north through peat bogs toward a narrow channel known as the IJ, a shallow waterway separating mainland from coastal dunes. It connected to nothing of consequence. By 1019, the Van Amstel family held stewardship of this soggy territory on behalf of the Bishop of Utrecht. They governed reeds and waterfowl. Their name appears in charters tied to a river most Europeans had never heard of. Then, in 1170, everything changed in a single day. The All Saints flood tore across the northern coastline, a storm surge so violent it reshaped the land itself. The shallow IJ widened into a vast estuary in hours. Dunes collapsed, barriers dissolved. Suddenly the Amstel had an open route to the Zuiderzee, and through it the IJssel and the North Sea trade routes beyond. The marsh became a gateway. The peat along the riverbanks, saturated for millennia, began to stabilize as tidal flows increased. For the first time, the mouth of the Amstel could support year-round habitation. The Van Amstel lords looked at their waterlogged fief and saw what no one had seen before. Not empty marshland, a harbour. Between 1264 and 1275, workers drove wooden pilings into the riverbed where the Amstel met the tidal marshes. They laid timber frames across the muddy channel. Stone by stone, they built a dam. It was simple infrastructure, a way to control flooding, a crossing point for travellers moving between the peat settlements. But it gave the place a name. In 1275, a document from Count Flor is the 5th granted toll exemptions to residents living apud Amstel Dam, at the dam in the Amstel, the first written proof that this cluster of wooden houses existed. The name stuck. By 1327, scribes were writing Amsterdam, a dam had become a town. The settlement was still small, perhaps 1,000 people by 1300, living in timber houses along narrow lanes that followed the curve of the river. Fishermen hauled their catches onto wooden quays. Merchants stored grain in warehouses built on stilts above the water. The dam itself became the town square, the commercial heart where goods crossed from boat to cart. What transformed this modest river crossing into something larger was fish. Dutch fishermen had worked the North Sea for generations, but in 1415 they perfected a new vessel design, the herringbuis. Longer than earlier boats, with holds deep enough to store barrels on deck, it allowed crews to stay at sea for weeks. They could gut and salt herring immediately, preserving the catch before it spoiled. This single innovation gave Dutch fishermen a monopoly on North Sea herring. And Amsterdam, positioned where the Amstel opened onto the Zuiderzee, became the natural market for this wealth. Herring brought capital Capital drew other trade. By the late 14th century, Amsterdam had joined the Hanseatic League, the network of merchant cities that controlled Baltic commerce. Timber from Norway, grain from Prussia, salt from France. Ships arrived, unloaded, departed. Then, in the 15th century, Amsterdam's merchants made a calculated move. They bypassed the Hanseatic middlemen entirely, sailing their own vessels directly to Baltic ports: Danzig, Riga, Lübeck. The margins were better, the risks were theirs to manage. Grain poured into Amsterdam's warehouses, not for local consumption but for redistribution across Western Europe. The city became what traders called a staple market, a place where bulk goods were stored, sorted and sold onward. The wooden dam had become a hinge in the continental economy. By 1500, the settlement Count Flor is the fifth had granted toll privileges to had outgrown its marshland origins. The fishing village was now a trading port, and the timber dam, still standing after 2 centuries, would soon prove too small for what was coming. By the 16th century, Amsterdam answered to a distant throne. Philip II of Spain ruled the Low Countries as defender of Catholic Christendom. His Inquisition-hunting reformers threw market squares and guild halls. The revolt began with money. New taxes, the 10th penny on every sale, strangled merchants already struggling with war levies. Then came faith. Protestant ministers preached in open fields beyond city walls, whilst royal soldiers dragged suspected heretics to interrogation cells. The northern provinces rose first, seizing town halls, expelling Spanish garrisons. Amsterdam waited. Whilst cities like Leiden and Haarlem declared for the rebels, Amsterdam's wealthy Catholic merchants held their nerve. Spanish silver flowed through their warehouses. The Habsburg armies seemed invincible. Better to endure than to burn. Then the calculus shifted. In 1578, with Spanish forces overstretched and rebel fleets controlling coastal waters, Amsterdam's gates opened not to conquerors, but to citizens who'd simply had enough. No siege, no battle. The magistrates who'd served Spain 1 week swore oaths to William the Silent the next. What followed was surgical. Every Catholic church in the city, the Oude Kerk, the Nieuwe Kerk, chapels built over 3 centuries, was stripped of altars, statues and sacraments within months. Calvinism became the only lawful faith. Priests fled or went underground. Catholic worship didn't vanish, but it disappeared from view, conducted in hidden rooms above warehouses, behind false walls in canal houses. These clandestine churches would endure for nearly 300 years. The conversion reshaped more than worship. Church properties became civic halls, orphanages, guild halls. The city's power structure tilted Protestant. To hold public office now required reformed membership. Catholics remained, many stayed wealthy, but they governed nothing. Yet Amsterdam had made its choice. The rebellion that began as a tax revolt hardened into the 80 Years' War. And whilst the city's population remained modest compared to the great Flemish cities to the south, that balance would soon shatter. 17 years after Amsterdam joined the revolt, Spanish forces would take Antwerp, and when Antwerp fell, its refugees would flood north, carrying skills, capital and ambition that would transform this canal-ringed city into something no one yet imagined. If rebuilding these lost moments matters to you, consider becoming a channel member. Your support lets me keep reconstructing history, one city at a time. The first ships were already arriving. In August 1585, the Spanish army of Flanders tightened its siege around Antwerp. For 13 months the city had held out. Now, with the river blockaded and food exhausted, Antwerp surrendered. The wealthiest trading centre in northern Europe fell silent under Spanish rule. Within weeks, merchants began leaving. They packed account ledgers, trade contacts, skilled workers. They moved north to the one major port still free, Amsterdam. By 1600, the city's population had grown from 30,000 to 50,000. By 1610, it reached 105,000. The numbers kept rising. These weren't just Flemish Protestants fleeing persecution. Portuguese Jews arrived, carrying centuries of commercial expertise from Lisbon and Antwerp. French Huguenots came after their own persecutions intensified. German craftsmen, Scandinavian traders, English dissenters, all found Amsterdam more tolerant than the cities they'd left. In 1603, Jews received permission to practice their religion openly. By 1639, the first synagogue stood complete. Some called Amsterdam the Jerusalem of the West. The city that received them wasn't prepared for such growth. The medieval centre, hemmed by its old defensive walls, couldn't hold this population. In 1613, the city council approved an expansion plan. Engineers designed 3 new concentric canals curving around the old core, the Heirengracht, the Keizersgracht, and the Prinsengracht. Workers dredged channels through peat. They drove thousands of wooden piles to support foundations. Merchants built tall, narrow townhouses along the water. By the 1660s, when the population reached 200,000, Amsterdam had quadrupled its size. But the real transformation wasn't physical, it was financial. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, consolidated 6 competing trading companies into one. The Amsterdam Chamber dominated, holding the largest share of capital. The company needed vast sums to fund voyages to Asia, fleets of ships, warehouses, fortifications, trade goods. Individual merchants couldn't bear such costs alone, so the company issued shares. Anyone could buy a portion of ownership. Anyone could sell their shares to someone else. The VOC office in Amsterdam became a trading floor. Merchants gathered daily to buy and sell shares, speculating on voyage outcomes, on war news, on harvest reports from Java. Prices fluctuated. People bought expecting prices to rise, others sold short, betting on decline. Within years, a sophisticated market emerged, the world's first stock exchange, not by royal charter, but by merchant practice. In 1609, the city established the Bank of Amsterdam. It accepted deposits, cleared payments between merchants, provided credit. Unlike earlier banks, it held reserves, stabilizing the currency. Amsterdam became the financial hub connecting Baltic grain merchants, Caribbean sugar traders, Asian spice importers, African slave markets. Money flowed through the city's counting houses like cargo through its warehouses. The wealth was staggering. By mid-century, Amsterdam controlled more shipping tonnage than England, France, Spain, Portugal, and the German states combined. VOC ships returned from Asia loaded with pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, silk, porcelain. WIC vessels, the Dutch West India Company, traded across the Atlantic, carrying enslaved Africans in brutal conditions to Caribbean plantations, returning with sugar and tobacco. Amsterdam's merchants profited from every leg of these triangular routes. The city's tolerance had limits, calculated by trade advantage rather than principle. Catholics could worship in hidden churches, but not openly. Jews could trade, but not join guilds. Yet compared to most European cities, Amsterdam offered space to breathe. By 1660, the Golden Age was fully realized. Rembrandt painted in his studio. Philosophers like Baruch Spinoza debated freely. Ships crowded the harbour. The stock exchange buzzed with speculation, and through the new canals, barges carried the wealth of 4 continents into the heart of a city that a century before had been a modest trading port on a muddy river. The refugees who fled Antwerp's fall had rebuilt more than their lives. They'd created the financial centre of the world. By 1700, the canals still curved through the city in their familiar rings. The warehouses still lined the harbour. But the ships that had once sailed to every corner of the known world now sat idle more often than not. Wars drained the city's strength. First England, then France. Naval battles in the Channel. Trade routes severed. The fleets that had made Amsterdam wealthy found themselves outgunned, outmaneuvered, driven from seas they'd once commanded. Commerce that had flowed through the port for a century began seeking other harbours, other markets. The population stopped growing. For decades it held steady near 240,000, a vast number, but frozen. No expansion, no new canal rings. The city that had rebuilt itself twice in living memory now simply endured. Yet in 1750, a traveller arriving from anywhere in Western Europe would have found themselves in the continent's 4th largest city. Only London, Paris and Naples were larger. For a nation as small as the Dutch Republic, this remained extraordinary. The physical city Amsterdam had built during its golden age, the concentric canals, the 1,000-gabled warehouses, the stock exchange, all of it survived intact, a monument to what had been achieved. Then came Napoleon. Holland absorbed into the French Empire. Amsterdam's significance reached its lowest point in centuries. British warships controlled the seas. French armies controlled the land. The trading networks that had sustained the city for generations collapsed completely. By 1820, fewer than 200,000 people remained. The Congress of Vienna changed the map again. The United Kingdom of the Netherlands emerged, joining North and South under a single crown. Amsterdam would not return to what it had been. That age had passed. But the foundations for recovery were laid. What followed, decades later, was not a return to the past, but something different. Industrialization came late to Amsterdam compared to England or Belgium, but when it arrived, it transformed the city once more. Engineers began work on a canal to the Rhine, direct access to the continent's greatest river. Then another canal, cutting through the dunes to the North Sea, shortening the route to open water by hours. Both projects took years. Thousands of labourers dug through sand and peat. Stone was laid, locks installed. When the canals opened, ships that had been turning away from Amsterdam returned. Goods flowed again, now by steam, not sail. The city built monuments to this industrial age. A central railway station rose on artificial islands in the harbour, designed by Pierre Cuypers in red brick and stone. The same architect designed the Rijksmuseum, housing the nation's greatest artworks. The Concertgebouw Concert Hall opened its doors, its acoustics among the finest in Europe. Population growth resumed, though modest. New neighbourhoods spread beyond the old canal rings. Factories appeared. By 1900, 70% of residents identified as Christian, Dutch Reformed, Catholic, a minority Jewish. The religious makeup had shifted, but the canals remained, the warehouses remained. Amsterdam had survived its long decline, reinventing itself once more. The Netherlands declared neutrality when war broke out in 1914. But neutrality didn't mean safety. British and German blockades strangled trade, food shipments stopped, coal ran short. By the winter of 1917, hunger riots broke through Amsterdam's streets. They called it the Aardappeloproer, Proer, the Potato Rebellion. Police opened fire. People died in squares that had once traded silks and spices. The war ended. The canals still curved through the city. Neighbourhoods pushed north and west, swallowing farmland that had fed medieval fishermen. By 1940, 600,000 people lived in Amsterdam. 60,000 of them were Jewish, families who'd arrived centuries before, and refugees who'd fled Austria and Germany in the years just past. On the 10th of May, 1940, German aircraft crossed the border at dawn. The Netherlands surrendered 5 days later. Wehrmacht troops marched through Dam Square. What followed wasn't sudden. It was methodical. Registration. Identification cards stamped with the J shops marked. Curfews, exclusions. In February 1941, German police arrested 427 Jewish men and sent them east to Mauthausen concentration camp. 2 survived. 300,000 Amsterdam workers walked off the job in protest. Dockers, tram drivers, clerks. It was the largest anti-pogrom strike in occupied Europe. German authorities crushed it within 2 days. The arrests continued. Families were pulled from homes along Jodenbreistraat and VAH Terlouwplein, streets that had housed synagogues and kosher bakeries since the Golden Age. They were crammed into transit camps, then loaded onto cattle cars heading east. 56,521 Dutch Jews were murdered at Auschwitz, 34,082 at Sobibor, more than 100,000 in total. Some hid in attics, in cellars, behind false walls. A girl named Anne Frank and her family concealed themselves in rooms above a canal house on Prinsengracht. For 2 years they stayed silent while the city moved below. In August 1944, someone betrayed them. Anne died at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in early 1945, weeks before liberation. Canadian forces entered Amsterdam on the 5th of May. The Wehrmacht surrendered. But the canals reflected a broken city. Communications were severed. Food had run out months before. Survivors dug tulip bulbs from frozen ground and boiled them to stay alive. Of Amsterdam's 60,000 Jewish residents, only those who'd hidden, or the handful who survived the camps, came home. Entire neighbourhoods had been emptied, synagogues stood silent, the architecture remained, the people did not. When the war ended, Amsterdam rebuilt outward. New suburbs rose on reclaimed polder, Oostdorp, Esselo Terfart, Bijlmermeer, neighbourhoods of public parks and social housing, built to standards the medieval centre had never known. But the old city nearly didn't survive peace. Planners proposed motorways through the Canal Ring, office blocks to replace merchant houses. The former Jewish quarter, already emptied, faced demolition first. Then in 1977, bulldozers arrived at NIAW Markt Square, residents blockaded the streets. The new Markt Rellen riots stopped the machines. The historic centre was saved. Immigration reshaped the population. Indonesians arrived after independence in 1949, Turkish and Moroccan workers in the 60s, Surinamese after 1975. By 2023, 180 nationalities lived here, autochthones a minority in 2/5 of neighbourhoods. In 2010, the Gracht ten Gordel gained UNESCO World Heritage status. 7 years later, 17 million tourists walked those same streets annually. The canals that survived conquest, decline and occupation now face a different pressure: gentrification, short-term rentals, residents priced out of their own city. Amsterdam endures, as it always has. But the question remains, heritage site or living city? The balance has yet to be struck.